It was in one of the previous devotionals that I mentioned that I had gone skydiving with my son for his birthday. And I think I recall telling you that was a scary moment. You know, as I revisit some other moments in my life that had me somewhat terrified, they would include whitewater rafting on Class 5 rapids in Alaska. They would include those rides some of us have taken on top of the hotels in Las Vegas. They would also include for me snorkeling off of the coast of Kauai and running into a 7-foot white-tip reef shark with no barrier between us. Some of you, when I ask what are the more scarier moments in your life that you faced, maybe you jettison from some of those trivial things that I just mentioned into I'm out of a job or I am struggling with a health issue. Either way, I think what happens in those moments is they capture our attention. It's interesting that in those times where we don't know what the outcome is going to be, that thing, whatever that is, has our undivided attention. I remember one time sending one of my children out to go get the mail, and fiendishly, I hid behind one of the pillars as they came back through the front door, and I jumped out and scared them. And they took flight. And I knew I had their undivided attention by the look on their face. And while maybe that wasn't the best parenting move, it reinforced to me when we don't know the outcome, whatever it is that caused that has our undivided attention. You know, I was thinking about that a while ago, and I was reminiscing with myself about how many times has Christ had my undivided attention. I have to admit, sadly, I think it's mainly during those times of crisis. It's during those times when I have nowhere else to turn that Jesus gains my undivided attention. And while those are great times to turn our attention to Jesus, man, I have lived in many days in this past season of the pandemic where one day has run into another, monotonous, if you will. And while that has benefited me in some ways, it really has drawn me somewhat away from the Lord. The comfort, the monotony, the feeling of being isolated without too many terrible pressures didn't put me in a position of giving God my full and undivided attention. And maybe you're in that same economy. Maybe this pandemic hasn't hit you as hard as it's hit other people. And because of that, maybe your cupboards are full. Maybe you don't have health issues. Maybe you still are working and getting a paycheck. I wonder in these moments of monotony, does Jesus still have our undivided attention? I want to turn our attention to the book of 2 Corinthians and challenge us to be awake to Jesus, even in moments of comfort or monotony. Paul says this in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. He says, I want you to be awake in 3 areas of your life. The first is letting Jesus. And I think what he means by that is found in verse 14 of 2 Corinthians 5. Listen to what Paul says. He says, for the love of Christ controls us, having concluded this, that one died for all, therefore all died. I want to be awake to letting Jesus. In those moments of crisis and even in those moments when things are calm, I want to be awake to letting Jesus. What do you think I mean by that? Well, I think what I mean by that is I want things to, because they're not in my control, to be out of the love that Jesus has provided for me. Paul says, let the love of Christ control you. And in one version, it actually says, let love of Christ compel you. It's interesting, if I were to think of practically how God do I want the love of Christ to compel me or control me, what immediately comes to my mind is the area of forgiveness. I think sometimes, especially in these moments where I'm isolated with my family members, one of the more difficult things for me to do is ask and give forgiveness. But boy, what a testimony to letting the love of Christ control me if I could show that to those whom I love. The second thing I think Paul says to me is be awake to living Jesus. Be awake to letting Jesus, be awake to living Jesus. Look at verse 15. And he, Christ, died for all, that they who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again on their behalf. See, if I'm awake to living Jesus, what that means is that I recognize that I'm no longer living for myself. Rather, I'm living for him. Well, again, practically, how would that play out in this season where I'm not around too many other people? I think for me, it plays out by asking God every day, how can I serve those around me? See, when I'm serving others, it's really hard to be living for myself. And can I just speak to the younger generations maybe? Wouldn't it be great if we could just take that mantle upon ourselves and serve mom and dad, grandma, grandpa, aunt or uncle, older brother, older sister without being asked to do so? I just want to toss that out for your consideration. How can I live for Jesus in this moment and not necessarily for myself? Finally, I believe Paul says this in verses 16 to 20 of 2 Corinthians 5. I think he says, be awake to sharing Jesus. Be awake to sharing Jesus. Listen to, won't read the whole passage, but listen to the first two verses and the last two. Paul says in verse 16, therefore from now on we recognize no man according to the flesh, even though we have known Christ according to the flesh, yet now we know him no longer. Therefore, if any man is in Christ, he is a new creature. The old things have passed away, behold, the new things have come. And then in verse 20, Paul says this, therefore we are ambassadors for Christ. As though God were entreating through us, we beg you on behalf of Christ to be reconciled to God. He made him who knew no sin, to be sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. What if I treated people during this season that they matter to Jesus? What if I looked at people as, because you matter to Jesus, I want you to know Jesus? I was reminded when I thought about that of two college students in Southern California who heard a message on ministering to the disenfranchised. And rather just hearing a message and going back to their dorm rooms and feeling good about a good message, they actually left college for 6 months and went and lived among the homeless. And through that, shared their faith with people. I thought, boy, that's a radical example of sharing Jesus with others. Maybe a more localized example would be, am I treating my neighbors the way Jesus wants me to treat them? Am I loving them, maybe in this time in creative ways, but demonstrating that I'm available to pray for them, to talk with them, to serve them in their time of need? I'll close with this. In the wall on my classroom, one of the walls, somebody stenciled these words. They're from the group Sidewalk Prophets. And they wrote a song named Be Strong in the Lord. And these are the words that are on my classroom wall that I look at every day. Be strong in the Lord and never give up hope. You're going to do great things, I already know. God has his hand on you, so don't live in fear. Forgive and forget, but don't forget why you're here. Take your time and pray. These are the words I would say. You know, someone once said, I would rather attempt to do something great for God and fail than to do nothing and succeed. I hope that serves as an encouragement to you today.